They wanted me, their secular, sort of atheist, politically liberal, intellectual oncologist, to provide them with spiritual. When you see something so incredible that, that you think it's impossible because you decided it's impossible, and then somebody does it,
Yeah.
then you go, oh, well, it isn't impossible. They finally conceded telos, or they conceded that purpose is a real thing. Not faith, faith is a virtue, and so we don't have entirely have control over it in the sense that we don't just decide to have it one day. And I've known people who were born with faith that was unshakable, and I know people who keep turning away from faith. Uh, One of the key, you know, themes that runs through my generation, that is to say, the boomers, who I think I speak for, in particular, is that we are the generation, the last generation that straddled the fence between a society that where almost everyone was religious and went to church, and the society now which is largely secular. But and what's even more interesting is that the Gen X, so to speak, people are politically more conservative, and they are now in the generation where intelligent design theory is making atheism very hard to accept
Mm.
in a scientific way. But so getting back to boomers, um, what happened in our generation was, again, we were taught a bunch of lofty notions about justice and patriotism. You know, my father fought in the Second World War, uh, and it was all black and white. And then Vietnam happened, and it was a big turnaround. Like, what are we doing here? And
Mhm.
how did we go from the most benevolent power in the history of the human race to doing what was going on in Vietnam? And I understand geopolitical politics are complicated, and Nixon and Johnson were motivated for theoretical fears of certain things that in retrospect probably weren't justified. But in the moment, that's what they did. And we all know the outcome of that. And while that was going on, Jim Crow was dissolving, but there was systemic racism in our society through the 60s, with red line housing agreements with banks and so on. And then we were all worried about the environment. And then Watson and Crick came up and said, by the way, life is a chemical reaction, and we defined it now. And so you can let go of these mythologies that led to these apparent disasters that contradict how you were raised. And one of the things about how I was raised was that there was, and this is understandable, I'm not being critical, I'm just saying, as I think about it in retrospect, that that America could do no wrong, period, and that Christianity could do no wrong, period. And then when you see these things going on that seem to be black and white injustices like racism and the war in Vietnam and environmental pollution, you go, wait a minute, this is all wrong, and you have to acknowledge it. And I think for my parents' generation, the one thing that they had a hard time doing was acknowledging that things were going in the wrong direction. And that's because they went through their own enormous transition from the Depression and Hitler's near conquest of
Mhm.
the world. If he had uh, not attacked Stalingrad, and if the Japanese had hit the carriers on 7741, not 741, we'd be in a different world. And they overcame all of that. And so they had every right to have unshakable faith in their way of doing things. And then, of course, that hubris led to the mistakes that followed. And I think one of the hardest lessons for some people to learn is that really good people make really big mistakes. And that's just life. One of the biggest mistakes ever made in American political history was made by one of the greatest uh, politicians in American history, namely Teddy Roosevelt, who transformed labor in America. And he was so successful that he gave up running on a second term because he thought he'd solved everything, not realizing that
Mm.
as soon as he left office, things fell apart, and he tried to recapture them with um, the Bull Moose Party, and he failed. And so, I mean, really good people make really big mistakes, and you have to say, okay, that's our condition. That's why God didn't make us perfect after the fall, and here we are. So, anyway, getting back to uh, those of us who came of age in the 60s and 70s, that is, I mean, graduated from high school, went to college, went to medical school, and so on, saw the Vietnam War and saw the mistakes were being made, and finding out that life is a chemical reaction. And I was in California, I was at Berkeley at the center of all the scientific revolution. And basically, my professor said, if you don't buy into scientific atheism, you're really stupid. I
Hmm.
mean, here it is, black and white. I mean, come on. And so, you're in that milieu. You want to be successful. You want to be uh, with what's modern and happening, and so people like me made a big mistake myself in buying into that because I wanted to be a respectable scientist and go to MD Anderson and cure cancer. That's what I did, tried to do.
Hmm.
And then after going to the greatest cancer center in the world and becoming a professor, I realized we're not getting anywhere with this. We're just poisoning people and making very small progress. And okay, that's science. If you're a scientist, you have to accept that. But it didn't seem right, didn't feel right. And so I got as far away from that as I could. And I went out to a small town in southeastern Washington, Walla Walla, where everyone is there raising cattle and growing wheat and growing wine.
Mm.
And started. I was the first board certified medical oncologist in the entire region, 100 miles in every direction. And I started a little cancer center at the regional hospital, which was part of Providence. And so they had resources, and we were far enough away from academics. I mean, 300 miles from Seattle or Portland. And so we had our own little medical center, and I was going to cure cancer on my own there, and found out that I could do my best with the science I had and the biology that we had, the medicine that we had. But we were still, people were dying of cancer because that's what happens, even if your name is Michael Landon or Jackie Onassis
Yeah.
or Steve McQueen or Vishal Varan. And I just plugged away at it, trying to um, get a sense of it by being immersed in it. And a strange thing happened, which was that in this little town was politically very conservative, and virtually every patient that I had was a churchgoer. They wanted me, their secular, sort of atheist, politically liberal, intellectual oncologist, to provide them with spiritual advice.
Mm.
And I didn't know how or why that was supposed to happen because I'm a doctor with a medical degree. I'm not a cleric. I um, walked away from religion 20 years before then, but it dawned on me that, I was probably the smartest person in their life, so to speak, at least with
Yeah.
respect to the issues that pertain to them, meaning science and biology and cancer medicine. And uh, I was thrust into this position of becoming sort of taking the role of their cleric, and I felt like saying, "Well, you go to church. Why don't you ask your pastor, your rabbi,
Right.
what waits for you when I'm done doing what I'm doing, which will at some point end, and you will some at some point your life will end, and that's not my business." but it turned out to be my business, and I didn't wasn't prepared for it, and so I was in the quest for providing whatever my patients needed from me. Uh, I said, well, maybe I should actually do something about this, or try and find some way to offer succor
Yeah.
without being overtly religious. Again, you're not allowed to be religious in the medical clinic. That
Yeah, as
is
a
to say, you're not allowed
scientist.
to
Yeah.
proselytize. You're not allowed to proselytize. So if someone comes into your office and they don't believe in Jesus, you can't start telling them to believe in Jesus. It's not malpractice, but it's a breach of boundaries, because of
Hmm.
the asymmetry of the relationship. I have the power of life over death as far as they're concerned. I can decide I don't want to give them any more chemo and let them die, or I can work really hard and keep them alive for another year. And so it's not that making that choice for any political or religious reason would enter my mind. The fact is, it's theoretical. It's the same reason why you can't have a romantic relationship with a patient. You
Hmm.
just are not allowed to, because they see you as someone with who they want to please, even though the reason for pleasing you is not romantic. It's because they want you to save their life. Well, that's not that's not a justification for romance.
Yeah.
That's somewhat, so we don't, we're not allowed to do that. We don't, of course. But anyway, uh, at the same time, it had been 25 years since I left MD Anderson, and I was saying to myself, well, hold on, we're supposed to be done curing cancer by now. I mean, we know the chemicals that make everything happen in the world, and we can make chemicals to inhibit the chemical reactions we don't want, so we could find a chemical that inhibits the translation of the cancer gene. And so, why am I still making people's hair fall out and vomit 40 years after we were supposed to be done with this? Nixon declared the war on cancer in 1972. In 1992, 20 years later, nothing had changed. And in 2002, 30 years later, nothing had changed. And so, the thing is, in science, what you do is you understand, you see the world and you see a problem and you say, I wonder if I could fix this problem. And so you try things, you have a theory. Well, if you try out the theory and it doesn't work, it means that the theory is wrong. So if someone says, I want to be able to create a mechanized um, thing for getting off the ground.
Yeah.
And so, for lots of trial and error, they built airplanes. So it didn't happen overnight, and they got better and better over time. Well, and then jets and then rockets and so on. But in cancer, it seemed like we were just chasing our tails. And so then I thought, well, maybe the whole God is dead, life is just chemical. You're an accident of the universe and some little planet at the far reaches of some insignificant gallery in the midst of a universe full of galaxies. Maybe that whole existential Friedrich Nietzsche, Charles Darwin mythology is, in fact, a myth. And so, it's very hard to disavow to disavow the principles, the intellectual principles that made you successful in life. Like, oh, okay, everything I've learned is wrong. I think I'll become a carpenter and stop doing what
Right.
I'm doing. Well, you can't do
Right.
that. I had a friend of mine once who said, when we were complaining about, changes in medicine and how hard it was getting, he said, well, what are you going to do? Become a carpenter? No, once you go through what it takes to get a medical degree, you do that for the rest of your life,
Of
as long
course.
as you want to keep working, for the most part. Um, anyway, um, and so the science of the very end of the 20th century was starting to go down, spin off into different directions. Something that came out was something called chaos theory, which now is called complexity theory, which, basically said that this notion of the linear arrangement of life on Earth, that there's a DNA molecule that makes a protein, which makes an organism, that AB equals CD. That's way, 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 way simplified. And so, okay, let's rethink it because um, we missed out on something on the pathway to curing cancer. What did we
Apparently,
miss?
yeah.
And then as you start unwinding that thread, you find out that it's an endless complexity. And then the whole scientific atheism theory of Darwin and Dawkins and so on unravels. And so at that time, there's a saying in Zen Buddhism, which I studied because it was sort of religious without and still sort of secular, and I was trying to find my way back.
Yeah.
There's a saying, when the student is ready, the master will appear. And until you're ready, like you've probably talked to people who don't agree with you politically or religiously, and they don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear it. As Bill O'Reilly keeps saying, people are going to believe what they want to believe, and he
Yeah.
says that about once a week at his broadcast every week, and it turns out to be true that people have to be ready to hear what you have to say, and and so that was when the angels came into my life because I was finally ready to think outside of the intellectual prison that I had locked myself into.
Yeah. And I mean, and so they're appearing in your life, and I can relate to that because there were times. I'll probably cut out half the things I say, but there were times like in my experience as an atheist where I ran up or into some very intelligent Christians who provided reasoned arguments, but I was just looking to dismiss what they said, and then it wasn't until late whenever I was in college, which by the way, not a scientific background, but I thought I knew everything whenever it came to it just by listening to Dawkins or something, but by the time it came late towards the end of college, I ran into a professor and then his son who had a book by who knew of a book by a Christian physicist that they shared with me. But I was doing like some types of activism. I was like heavily into libertarianism at that time, and so one of them like shared with me a book. It was like Quantum Physics, Near-Death Experiences, Eternal Consciousness, Religion, and the Human Soul. And so like I opened it up, but it was at that point whenever I was ready. So they acted as a messenger from God. It's not like a real manifestation of an angel, but a person who was sent into my life. They were directed in some way, unbeknownst to them, unbeknownst to anybody else, but they just were sent in a fashion with information when I was ready that opened my eyes to the truth. And so then that is like what you're talking about whenever you're talking about angels. It's not like a real manifestation of it, but it's like a messenger from God is sent to you, a real human sent to you. And in the cases, in your case, it was patience.
Russell, Bertrand Russell was a committed atheist, and he was trying to get, and this is in the 20s and 30s, he was trying to get everyone who was the whole society was, of course, very devout religious, Western Europe at the time. And he was trying to get everyone to see that atheism made more sense. And
Mhm.
his famous quote was, the biggest problem we have with people is belief. We can't do anything about belief. And so the thing is, um, you can intellectualize everything you want, but eventually it comes down to faith and belief, and that is a virtue, just like you care about people or not. Faith, hope, and charity. You're either optimistic or you're not. You either care about people and you're charitable or you're not. And faith is clouded up by your experience and by your intellectualism, but at some point, something has to get to your heart and not your head
Of
to
course.
get you to see, as was in that wonderful movie Signs by Mel Gibson, tell Grant see. Where the guy, Mel Gibson character played a priest who lost his faith because his wife died, and then there was a miracle, and he finally saw. all of the coincidences that weren't coincidences that saved his life and the planet from the
Yeah.
horrible aliens. That's the message of the movie that there are no coincidences. You have to see, and when you see it, then you believe it. And so I had to, in order for me to overcome my intellectual hubris, um, I had to see something that rolled away the stones. And it was one of the weird things that was happening in my practice, as I said, about patients wanting me to be their spiritual advisor. I said, well, you don't really have a good faith, do you? I mean, you don't want to listen to your cleric and you want some secular atheist to help you die. That's not doesn't speak well for your belief
Right.
system. And so two people came into my life who had it's sort of like saying, well, it's not possible to win 7 Super Bowls until Tom Brady did it. It's not possible to hit 60 home runs until uh, Babe Ruth did it. Um, and so when you see something so incredible that, that you think it's impossible because you decided it's impossible, and then somebody does it,
Yeah.
then you go, oh, well, it isn't impossible. The rest of us have failed at it, but that's because we we're imperfect and
Of
we
course.
haven't tried hard enough and we haven't reached that goal, but it really is possible. And so when Pavel, which is the Russian word for Paul, by
Pavel.
the way, of course,
Okay.
um, came into my life, he showed me a faith that was so perfect and so immovable that I didn't realize I didn't know that existed. When I was growing up and everyone was faithful, it's because everybody was. That was the norm. You know, I mean, of course you go to church and you so on and so on. But in a secular society, this guy was dirt poor, uh, had to eat radiated grain from the Chernobyl disaster
Whew.
because that's all the food there was. He was out in Ukraine, and then he came over and he suffered this really miserable disease and death, and he never complained about anything. He always smiled. He always bowed to me. He couldn't speak English and I couldn't speak Ukrainian, but the reason he was there was because there was a small Ukrainian community in our little town, and they translated. And then when he when he died, before he died, in those days we let people die in the hospital for palliative reasons. And I brought him into the hospital because he didn't have long to live, and there was a lot of suffering that was going to happen before he died because his spleen was the size of a watermelon and he had no blood and he was turning white and his pain in his abdomen was absolutely excruciating. And in those situations, typically, what I've done many, many, many times is give people morphine to ease their suffering and allow them to die without as much pain as they would otherwise. And I've hospitalized him, and he refused any pain medicine.
Wow.
And so I sat him through the night of his last night at his bedside while he sat there, and he never complained at all. All he did was look at me and smile. And he wasn't smirking, he was pleased to be dying in my presence as if he knew he was a messenger. And of course, he didn't speak English and the interpreter wasn't there. So it wasn't like sitting there, with
Hmm.
a scroll and saying, I'm from heaven and I blah, blah, blah. It wasn't anything like that because belief can't be like that. I tell people who have trouble believing in Jesus, I say, well, if Jesus shows up and starts walking down the street, performing miracles, and of course you're going to believe it, but then you don't have faith. What
Right.
you are doing is you're believing in some empirical fact, and that's not faith. Faith is believing in what is what you what your soul tells you must be true without empiricism. That's what faith is. Turning your cheek is loving the person who hurt you, not loving the person who feeds you every day and and gives you $1 million for being good looking. That's not love. That's just getting what I'm getting out of this. Um, and so it was as close to a miracle as I could see without, of course, him levitating off the bed or doing
Yeah.
anything non-physical. Um, and when he died, he looked up at the ceiling as if he was being called, and I was holding his hand, and he gripped me really hard, and then his eyes closed, and he took his last breath while I was there. And it was as if, his soul had been lifted out of his body and went away. And you could say, oh, it's just my imagination. I don't care what you call it. um, I'm going to bring up a point that is brought up often enough,
Yeah.
which is quite apropos. There was this movie called Pulp Fiction, which is really a stupid, poofy movie about gangsters and violence and drugs by Quentin Tarantino. But you see, it's a setting like that that can often contain a truth that you wouldn't otherwise get. So it's like Nixon creating a relationship with China. No Democrat could ever have done that because they would have been called a commie. But Nixon, who had been the biggest anti-communist in the history of politics in America, went and had détente with China. And he could get away with it because he was a Republican, a conservative Republican, and he wasn't going to be uh, swindled by the Chinese. And so in the movie, if you haven't seen it, it's worth watching. There's a gangster played by Samuel L. Jackson, the great Samuel L. Jackson.
Yeah.
And he's murdering people and doesn't give a heck a root about it, taking drugs, and he's a gangster. And he's in his dialogues with Terrence with Travolta, they're both gangsters. He seems like a decent guy. I mean, he's okay, but anyway, something happens to him and Travolta where they get shot at, and the person shooting at them misses at point blank range, and Travolta goes, "Oh, that was lucky," and the character played by Jackson says, "No, this was God interacting in my life." And Travolta says, "No, it was just a lucky accident." And the character played by Jackson utters the famous words. He says, "It doesn't matter to me how you feel about it. I felt the hand of God, period. I'm calling it a miracle. And that's the end of the story. You have to be touched by that. You have to have that epiphany, and it can be something as dramatic as getting shot at and not dying. A lot of people in near-death experiences where the
Mhm.
bullet misses them or they swerve off of a road in the ice and they land up right side up in their car or whatever. Um, they say that God did it, and good for them. Uh, I had that experience in the room with Pavel that night, and I was still largely an atheist who was
Yeah.
searching. And I thought, what just happened here? And as I put in my book, it took a while for me to break it down, to process it, to understand that it doesn't matter what your rational mind thinks. You know it. You saw it. Stop running away from it. And so later in my life, as I was going on my journey, I had a patient who was an LDS, and his wife they were in their 80s or something, but she was well preserved, and she helped me edit the book actually. And
Wow.
I was talking to her about, because LDS folks, a lot of them have a very deep, strong faith. I have a lot of respect for them. because of that. I mean, they walk the walk, they talk the talk, and I'm not saying other people don't. I'm just saying
Right.
that they
No, I got.
kind of unique. I
No,
mean, they
they're pretty
created Salt Lake
serious in their
City
commitments.
out of a
Absolutely.
salty desert. But anyway, what she said to me was, she said, Stephen, most of us, including you, think that in order to believe something, you have to see it. She says, not that's what no, it is. That's not what it is. You have to believe in order to see. In other words, if you don't think something is possible, then you're never going to see it if it's the elephant in the room, so to speak. You have to say there could be an elephant in the room, and then you go, "Hey, look, there's an elephant in the room. I hadn't seen it before because I didn't want to acknowledge such a thing." You have to believe in order to see. It's that other movie with Mel Gibson, Braveheart, where um, um, Robert the Bruce says, "I don't want to lose heart. I want to believe as he does." And it's a gift. Faith is a gift. You don't. You have to let it in. You have to be open to it. But you don't just go out and say, "I think I'll become faithful today."
Right.
God has to interact with you for you to have faith, because it's all totally unempirical. It's like Bertrand Russell said, "I can't break down their faith in these people. What's wrong with them?"
Right.
And it's because they had the gift. It's a virtue.
Yeah. No, faith is foundational. Are you familiar with the work of Dr. Guillen? Does that name ring a bell to you?
Who?
Dr.
Who?
Guillen, Guillen is the spelling of his last name. But I think I'm gonna send you a little bit of information on him because he's a physicist, and it ties into your believing is seeing point because he has a book by that title. But he has a background in physics, astronomy, and mathematics. He has doctorates in all three of those from Cornell. He was a science commentator for ABC for a while. He taught physics at Harvard for a while as well. But in his book, Believing is Seeing, he gets into faith. One thing that he addresses, because he's, also used to be an atheist, then came to faith. But one thing that he gets into is something like um, like the fact that 95% of the universe is immaterial, dark matter, dark energy, these things, can't be measured. So using a paradigm where we need to be able to test and perform measurements in order for that to be in order to understand something to be part of reality doesn't make sense when existing within a universe where 95% of it is unable to be measured and immaterial. So that's one thing he gets into. And then he also gets into Gödel's theorem, which I don't completely understand. Gödel, a mathematician, talked about like axiomatic beliefs and the idea that if in any system that is, it has the complexity of at least geometry, there's going to be like some foundational assertions, things that you need to have faith in order to then reason forward from, and that you're never going to be able to get back to the beginning just through empiricism. And he kind of comes to it from the point of view of a guy into mathematics. Um, but I'll share a little bit of that material. I think it's up your alley, and I think it kind of ties into a lot of what you've gotten into. Just wanted to share that with you.
Well, I've studied Gödel quite a bit,
Okay.
actually. So we can talk about that if you want. Um, but
Um,
one of the things about him is that he
yeah.
is considered probably the greatest intellect of the Western world in the 20th century. He was best friends with Einstein, and yet hardly anybody knows about him. And part of the reason no one seems to know about him, like he's not a household word, there are two reasons. One was he was a very strong proponent of faith,
Hmm.
and also his theory is extremely esoteric, except that it's you can boil it down to something extremely simple, which is that again, There's an old Zen saying, what is the sound of one hand clapping? And a Western logical person would say, well, I guess there's some noise in the air.
Yeah.
And that's not the point at all. The point is, you can take a language, whatever language you want, and you can create a sentence that sounds logical but isn't. And so there is no such thing as one sound of one hand clapping, because the definition of clapping requires two hands. But I've
Fair
asked a
enough.
question that can't be answered, and I did it with a fifth grade education, and and you don't seem to understand the limitations of your language or logic or linear thinking, which is
Right.
all of that. It's the same thing as, what is the sound of it if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it? Does it make a sound? And everyone says, well, of course it does. Well, the answer is it doesn't.
Hmm.
It does not. If you want to
Hmm.
say in a theoretical sense, does an object falling somewhere create vibrations in the medium around it, whether it's air or water? Well, yeah, of course. But when I say there is a sound, what it means is that there was a sentient being that perceived the quality, which became something that they were aware of. And if you disagree with that, then I can say, okay, well, you know what? There's phlegnon right here on my shoulder, and you can't see it. But the fact that you can't see it doesn't mean it's not real. There's a phlegnon right here and a pink parakeet right here, and it's
Sure.
too bad you can't see it. But just as real as a sound in the forest that nobody saw or heard.
Right.
And so the whole point of that is that this idea that you can disprove the existence of something non-empirical like a god through empiricism is a on its face contradiction. And getting beyond that, you may or may not. Most people don't know that in the early 20th century, Bertrand Russell and Alfred Whitehead were at the time considered the smartest people in the Western world. They sat down to write Principia 2, which was a takeoff on Newton's Principia 1, where they were going to reduce everything in the world to a series of axioms and statements that follow the axiom. Like if you say I have a number system that it says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which means that 2 + 2 = 4, and
Mhm.
because it's an axiom, it isn't arguable. Well, it turned out that they failed, utterly failed in their quest to do that, because language can't be reduced. In other words, logic can't be reduced. And so I'll give you an example. It's my favorite example. There is a little town in the north of Switzerland with 50 people in it, with one barber. And the barber, some people cut their own hair because they don't feel like paying the barber. And,
Sure.
and so the barber cuts the hair of everyone who doesn't cut their own hair. He does a haircut on all the people who don't cut their own hair. Who cuts the barber's hair? If he cuts his own hair, then he's not the person who cuts his own hair, because he's cutting the hair himself. And so you set up this system to try
Yeah.
and prove what's going on, and you run into what is a black and white contradiction. And all that tells you is the limits of language, the limits of logic. That's what Gödel's theorem was. There are limits to this. And yeah, you can decide all sorts of things like AI. But we have to understand that AI does not work because the computer is thinking,
Right.
period.
Right.
What I tell people is, where does the word Google come from? Everyone knows what Google is, but they don't know where the word came from. Well, we know there's the word trillion, which means a one and three sets of zeros after it, and then
It's a lot of
quadrillion
zeros.
is a one with four sets of zeros, and so on. Google is a one with 100 sets of zeros behind it, meaning that if you have all this data, you can sort through it real fast and come up with an answer. That's how AI works. It doesn't think at all. It just sifts through data to find an answer, the same that a child might try to figure out what 2 + 2 is. Oh, I see, it's 4. They didn't come up with it. They didn't decide, they didn't create their own number system. They just followed the rule.
Yeah. And
That's how
AI,
AI works. It doesn't think. It doesn't think in any abstract way.
and it has kind of like a framework or a structure where it's going to put these different inputs of language in. Um, and
Well,
that's
most human language and most human thinking is reducible. That's how why
yeah.
AI does work. So if you said, I got a picnic basket and I filled it up with food and we went to blank, you'd say you went to the park or
Right,
the
right.
zoo.
Yep.
And so Google searches every single statement in the his ever written on the internet about I packed a picnic basket and I went to, and it says sees park 100 times and zoo 3 times, and then it fills in the word zoo. You get that in your phone whenever you are texting somebody and you say, I think I'm going to go to the zoo tomorrow and see, and then it puts in the word animals
Yeah, you
because
ever
that's what happens when people go to zoos. They see animals, but it's not thinking. It's just knows that from looking what other people have done in the past that they see animals. It's saying you can train a dog a lot of things, but the
Mhm.
dog didn't figure anything out. You had to train it all these things.
Yeah. No, no, that's good. There's like a lot of rabbit holes we could go on with that. But I do think we should at least pull a thread or two on Talos. If I'm saying that wrong. It's all right. I majored in history. I'm currently
Telos.
working on a master's in biblical studies. So
Everybody gets that wrong. It's okay.
no, that's all right. Tell us. So with Telos, I guess we should start. What is Telos? And then I do want to pull some of the threads on hubris because I think that's kind of a theme in your thinking. And you get into the hubris both with Darwin and you get into it even with Isaac Newton. Um, but I guess we'll start with uh, what is Telos?
So again, it's telos,
Telos.
and telos.
Telos.
Telos is a Greek word. It's a Greek word invented by maybe the smartest person in the history of Western civilization, Aristotle. There are Platonists who don't like Aristotle, vice versa.
Hmm.
So Aristotle was, but in those days, the Greeks, there were a couple handful of really smart people who tried to figure out the world, and they did it without any instruments. And they didn't have microscopes or measuring devices. They just looked out the world and said, what's going on here? And all this was 300 to 500 years BC. And so there wasn't Christianity. There was Judaism, of course, but there wasn't a lot of Judaism in ancient Greece, but the mysticism of Judaism was present. Uh, and so the way Aristotle saw the world was um, he looked at animals, try and figure out what's going on. And he said, if you take a dog and you say, what are all these things that the dog has? Well, look at that. They've got leather on their feet. Their paws have got moccasins. They're already
Hmm.
there. And oh, they got these whiskers so they can sense other things. And they got this big nose so they can smell things. And they have these claws that help them to dig things. And it turns out that if you, even now in biology, if you dissect any animal, every single little tiny bit of that animal, kidneys, the liver, the eyes, the ears, the nose, the teeth, they do something purposeful. They have a function that they have to do. So, like if you look at a dog's mouth, they don't have any chewing teeth. They just all of their teeth, dogs and cats, are all sharp edged. They're just for ripping flesh. So they're carnivores. They don't um, eat tubers or berries the way. But a bear has sharp teeth up front and then human teeth in the back for because they eat berries and they eat roots. So they're more like omnivores. Uh, and so Aristotle said, well, all of the things in the world uh, come to existence because of four independent causes that caused. The big question was, why are these things here and where did they come from? Why is the sun there? Why is the water there? Earth, wind, and fire. And he said, and if you look at the other way to look at this is the easiest way to look at this is to look at any human artifact, a toaster, a hammer, a cell phone.
Hmm.
So let's start there because it's a little easier.
Yeah.
Take a house. Why is let's take a park bench.
Okay. Okay.
Why is there a bench in my backyard? Well, because I want to sit down. Okay. So before there was a park bench, you had to say, I'm tired of sitting on the grass because it's wet sometimes or it's snowy or muddy.
Yeah.
I want to sit on something and yet still be not standing up in my backyard or my pad. Okay, in my mind, I'm going to think of something that fulfills that purpose. And then you say, okay, now I want to make that thing. And so then you have to fulfill three other um, requirements. You have to decide on its form, whether it's long and slender for five people, or whether it's just for one person, more like a chair than a bench. And then okay, now I have to build it. So I have to find the material to build it. I can make it out of wood. I can make it out of straw. I can make it out of bamboo. I can make it out of cotton. The material required. And then you have to actually take the material and put it together so it realizes the form that you had in mind, so that in the end, you end up with a bench. And so, or a house, or a hammer, or a cell phone, or an airplane, or a car. Everything that comes into existence has these four causes, and these causes are independent. In other words, you say, I want to make a bench. Well, the material cause is independent of the form. In other words, like I said, there's 10 different things you can make a bench out of the material. And there, and then when you decide on the material, well, you can make it in a lot of different forms: long, skinny, tall, high. Think of a spoon. A spoon isn't a fork. And then you say, okay, now I still have to put the thing together somehow. So there has to be some fabrication process. But all of that is for the sole purpose of fulfilling a purpose, which is the end or the purpose. And this is the Greek word for that is telos, meaning in the end, what do I want to end up with? And so it has the name final cause. So there's formal cause, formal cause meaning what shape do I really want it to be in? The material cause is what is I'm actually going to make it out of? The efficient cause is how am I going to put it together? And then the final cause is what in the end did I want to end up with finally?
Yeah.
It's a little awkward, but that's the nomenclature. And so every human artifact, of course, is like that. You
Yeah.
can't like we'll have a hurricane go through a junkyard and end up with a running Ferrari.
Right.
And so then if you look at organisms, you say, oh my goodness, every single little tiny bit, we're in the medical school, we dissect humans and other organisms. Every tiny little bit, like your ear is shaped like a mega, like to collect sound with these little curves, because that's what it's supposed to do is collect sound. And your eyelids are there to protect your eyes when it's too bright. And you have teeth for chewing and your eyes for seeing and fingers to grab stuff. They all fulfill a function. There isn't anything, there are very few things anyway, that we call a vestigial, like the appendix or your tonsils. But
Hmm.
you have to understand that tonsils are of no use in the modern world with their antibiotics. But before their antibiotics, you had to have tonsils or you'd die of a throat infection.
You
And
know,
so,
even with vestigial organ, my wife's a surgical tech, and so she gets these surgical tech magazines. But anyway, I was just reading an article they had in there on the appendix, and even that seems to in some way contribute to our immune system. Um,
oh,
I
absolutely.
can't
So,
give you the
so
depths of it, but
30 years ago, like I was talking about the age of scientific atheism, they had identified all these what we call vestigial organs in the
mhm.
body, and they've had to walk all of that back so that there are only a few left that really don't seem to have a function because we haven't found them yet.
Yeah.
The best example, and this is really such an incriminating fact about scientific atheism, was that in 1990, um, when they had sort of sequenced the DNA, sort of, they made the proclamation, well, gee, there's all this DNA, but only 10% of it is coding for genes. And the other 90% isn't coding for genes. And we all know,
Yeah.
well, because we know everything, right? We all know that the reason for DNA is to code for genes. So the rest of this DNA is vestigial from organisms that we evolved from that made genes for things we don't need anymore. Like we don't need flippers anymore. We don't need gills to breathe underwater, and we don't need webbing in our
Tails.
toes anymore. And it turns out now that that was all a big fat lie, or it was all completely wrong,
Yeah.
although it was taught as hard science. See, there's vestigial crap which proves evolution because these genes come from other creatures that would, and it's just left over because when we evolved in humans, the genes didn't go away; they just became silent. It turns out now that that's not true at all. That all the parts of the DNA that don't code for genes code for something else, just as important, if not more important than DNA. And so that this whole business about the linear A plus B equals C plus D of 1965, DNA makes protein makes life, and that's the end of the story. Was is It's sort of like saying I have uh, a trash can cover that's round, and I have a broomstick, and if I connect four of those together with some pedals, I have a Ferrari.
Hmm.
That's how oversimplified it is, except that it's way, way more complicated than even that. And so when you take a cell and you open it up and you see what's going on in there, there's a complexity inside a cell that in one cell, 1/36 trillionth of your body, in there is a universe of functional molecular components that makes a Ferrari look like a hammer. That's how complicated everything is. It's sort of like when Hubble said, well, actually, no, those aren't supernova exploding. Those are whole other galaxies out there.
Hmm.
Because remember, in 1920, Einstein and everyone else said that the Milky Way was the universe. That was it. And of course, they didn't know any differently. Uh, and then, of course, Einstein said, well, there's something weird going on because if that's true, that the Milky Way is the universe and gravity is real, then it should collapse on itself because gravitation is weakened at distance, but it doesn't go to zero. And so, how come the stars are all out there not pulling towards each other? And so Einstein actually came up with an anti-gravity constant that he made up out of thin air because something had to account for the fact that the universe wasn't collapsing on itself. And it wasn't until the Big Bang theory that they said, "Oh, all this cosmology wasn't true." Now, Einstein wasn't trying to be an astrophysicist,
Hmm.
um, but you have to understand that the things that scientists come up with turn out to be often false. And of course, unless you were in a coma in 2020, we were all told that the COVID came from a bat somewhere in eastern China, and now we know almost for sure that it came from Wuhan in the virology lab.
Right.
But people were lost their jobs and lost lost their medical licenses for saying, I don't think that's true. And
Yeah.
yet the smart people, the scientists in the bureaucracies are saying, yes, it is, and we're going to punish you for being an apostate in our little scientific world that we live in. And this goes all the way back to I'm a scientist and I've proven there isn't a God. What the heck are you talking about? It's not possible to do that because science and God and religion are it's like water and vinegar. They're not the same.
Yeah. And there's a quote from a scientist in your book, and I don't Telos in your book Telos. There's a quote from a scientist in your book where don't remember the specifics, but he's just much more humble about what science can do. So on the one hand, it's definitely okay that science can't explain everything, that they're going to get things wrong. Um, and that's okay, but science should proceed with caution and not act with the hubris and saying because we have this naturalistic understanding, we have defeated God when their current understanding can be overturned in a decade or two decades. So there's just something about there's some like profound scientists who you had some discussion on who was called like the best scientist in 1,000 years or something like that. Um, just something about like scientists kind of proceeding, with caution. There's limitations to what they can do, and that's fine. That's what science is. It's kind of whenever they say that they can explain everything, where they kind of get into trouble or look like fools. Whenever you look back at them, so in history.
That's exactly the point. And get back to telos. Uh, Aristotle came up with his four categories of causation. Like I said, formality, material, fabrication, and purpose. And then because Aristotle wasn't a Christian, he didn't have any choice in the matter. Christ hadn't shown up yet. Um, his teaching was buried by the Christian church,
Yeah.
but it wasn't entirely lost. And so the greatest Christian theologian of all time, and this is not a debatable assertion, was St. Thomas Aquinas. And St. Augustine is a close second, and I have ultimate respect for Augustine. But they were 1,000 years apart, and Aquinas came along and he said, we believe in God because of revelation. In other words, there's this book that's called the Bible. It's the word of God. God said all these things, and so we believe it. That's revelation. God revealed himself, the word, through the the saints and apostles who took his word down, wrote it down for us.
Mhm.
That's revelation. But Aquinas said, we can also arrive at faith logically,
Through the book of nature,
intellectually,
right?
through the book of nature. In other words, you look around and you say, I don't know who God is or what he is or what he did, but I can tell somebody made this stuff. And so he was in Italy and he had to leave Italy in order to study Aristotle because you weren't allowed to study Aristotle in Italy. So he had to go to Paris, which was pretty progressive, and he studied uh, Aristotle, and he basically took Aristotle's teleology. Telos means is short for teleology, meaning
Okay.
things happen for a purpose that is not defined by Newton's laws, the laws of thermodynamics or science. Things just happen for a purpose because purpose is a reality in our existence. And it's been eliminated from scientific discourse because you can't measure it, except, of course, you can. They just don't want to measure it. Um, and Aquinas Christianized it because he said everything that Aristotle said was true, but I'm going to add to that um, purpose is the most real thing in the world, and and in order for there to be purpose, there has to be intention. In order for there to be intention, there has to be an entity that intends that thing to happen, and that is what we call God. In other words, he's the unmoved mover, so that your hand, the stick is moved by the hand, which is moved by the arm, which is moved by the human, which is moved by the father and mother of the human, which is moved by the world that created the father and the mother and the things that they lived on. And all of that is created by something that is unmoved, that is the primary mover, the unmoved mover, and that we call God. And so Einstein basically created what I consider, it was reading Aquinas that convinced me intellectually of the existence of God. That's why I wrote the book, because
Mhm.
he intellectually proves the existence of God. You can't have purpose in a world that is just a bunch of molecules bouncing off each other and randomly creating chemical reactions, because it turns out that there's nothing in Newtonian mechanics or quantum mechanics or thermodynamics that will ever allow that to happen. There has to be a guiding force or an agency, and that's what telos is. So again, becomes it becomes almost impossible for any thoughtful person to understand what I'm about to say to you and not say, okay, I agree with you. So here we go.
Go for
You
it.
and me and every human you've ever met and every human you've ever read about and every human who ever existed began as a single cell fertilized egg with half of their DNA from dad and the other half from mom in mom's ovum, her, and in that one cell, over time turned into an organism. It's true of all organisms, not
Yeah.
just you and me. 36 trillion cells. Now, the brain of that human has 10 billion neurons with 10 trillion neural connections. We call them synapses. And you have to say now, how is the information stored in one cell capable of flawlessly, seamlessly, perfectly putting together a brain with 10 trillion synapses so that I can talk to you and you can understand my words? The information can't be in there. It can't be in there. There's no way for that information to be in there. And so you have this miracle right before your eyes, the elephant in the room, of a thing that's happened for which there's no material explanation whatsoever, except it's so commonplace that we go, oh, well, what the heck? It's sort of like, well, the sun just happens to be 93 million miles away. So we just happen to have
Hmm.
four seasons. And the Earth, by the way, is the only planet that's tilted on its axis and that rotates so that we can have night and day and seasons. And it just happened that, well, you could say, okay, that's physics. I mean, there was a planet, it turned into a sphere and it got collided with the moon and it tilted and it started rolling around and trapped in gravitational force around the sun. It just happens to be Goldilocks distance away from the sun, not too hot, not too cold.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, boy, we sure are lucky. We did the lottery 50 times already. But then you talk about 100 trillion synapses in your brain all put together. Where did that information come from? It's not in the fertilized egg. It can't be. There's no such thing. There's no physical possible way that that information could be in there. This information is coming from something else. It's coming from the fabric of life. The fabric of life says, I'm going to take this thing and turn it into an organism of a complexity beyond your imagination, understanding that in those 10 billion neurons, inside each of those 10 billion neurons is a chemical machinery that's 1,000 times more complicated than the best AI computer ever made inside every cell. And that came from the one fertilized egg because the mother doesn't, transmit information to the embryo while it's growing. It just sits there and takes in fuel and takes in
Yep.
oxygen and gets fed through the umbilical cord until it comes out. And so where is this information coming from? Plato said that there were forms
Hmm.
that inform us from some ethereal place, and that's the other side of the coin of what Aristotle was says, which is what Aquinas sanctified through Christianity, that there is this force, this agency that creates who and what we are, and it's can't be pinned down in a test tube, and it can't be defined, and therefore it is immaterial, and it's called telos. That's what the book is about.
Paul uses the form, that Greek word form. He uses that in Philippians 2, Jesus being in the form of God, meaning something more significant than what we mean whenever we use form, being that he is in nature God. Um, I don't presume that you have all afternoon, so there was one last thing I wanted to dive into. Um, Whenever you wrote your book, it doesn't sound like, or I don't think at the time that you wrote Talos that you were seeing a lot of scientific. Sorry, I heard some echo. Seeing a lot of scientific literature kind of backing up what you were saying with purpose. But I heard you in another interview kind of speak to the fact that there's other biologists now who, while they don't call it a divine agent, they are kind of alluding to the same type of thing. I don't know. Could you shed some light on that? Could you shed some light
Well, I'd love to. And this is what I was alluding to earlier about uh, the Gen Z experience. The whole book of biology and science is being rewritten over the past 15 years. There was a famous atheist, Antony Flew, who wasn't a scientist, but he just
on that?
looked at the world and said, "Well, all this strife in the Second World War and nuclear bombs and stuff, and this is a crap hole." And but when he finally got to um, finally got to understanding DNA and complexity, he turned things around and he wrote a book called "There Is a God," which is sort of like a Democrat saying, "Yeah, abortion is wrong,"
Yeah,
or a Republican saying abortion is fine. That's how big of a turnaround it was. And so um, uh, Thomas Kuhn wrote a famous book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and he said that paradigms only end with a funeral because if someone discovers something, then you become the head of a department at Harvard, and everyone you hire for your lower professors have to agree with you, and until you die, um, it's going to stay that way. And so um, the the notion of purpose in organisms was considered non-scientific, and it was can't be measured, can't be quantified, so it's non-scientific. And so all the biologists of the 20th century, like Ernst Mayr and so on, Francis Crick and Monod, they all said, we can't use that word. It's not science. They're all dead. And E.O. Wilson, the last of those, is now dead. And the young scientists, in order to not be laughed out of the room, have to say, well, I guess there is purpose. I mean, when a penguin walks 60 miles over the snow with a gut full of dead fish to
yeah,
feed the male penguin who kept the egg warm through the horrible Antarctic winter, that's kind of purposeful, you know. And when a 3-inch salmon swims to Tokyo from Portland and comes back and goes up the same river and gives up its eggs or its sperm before it dies, that's pretty purposeful.
yeah,
And when your heart starts beating 6 months before you were born and keeps beating until you die, that's pretty purposeful. And so they finally conceded telos, or they conceded that purpose is a real thing. And so I have a website called The Science of Purpose, The Science of Purpose. It's science. Things are behaving in a purposeful way because it's empirical. So that's science. And so they realize now that in order to keep people from me, like saying that some immaterial, strange, platonic form influencing the world, or God forbid it, God,
God forbid
Yahweh,
the Christian
Adonai,
God.
Jesus. Yeah, that we have to come up. So they actually have published a book. It's called Evolution on Purpose. That's the title. And
Hmm.
it's written by all the up and coming biologists who are still hanging on by their fingernails to their atheism. And they're saying, yeah, well, purpose is real. And the reason it's real is because it's just a biologic fact. In other words, lions will sit around and sleep until they get hungry, and then something in their gut says, "I need food," and so they're driven to go make a kill. So they're behaving with purpose, but the reason they're behaving that way is because of a chemical reaction in their gut, which is driving them to go fulfill the purposes they have to eat, obviously. And I say, yeah, of course. Well, you can have that. But let's wind the clock all the way back to the first origin of life. And you have, as we're told, in a warm, dark pool somewhere, some molecules that coalesce to create autopoiesis, meaning self-sustaining chemical reactions. And then they gathered themselves a cell membrane so that they wouldn't dissolve when the acidity around them changed to the point, and so on. So we have this primordial cell, which is the origin of life. Why would that cell reproduce? It's just a cell. It's not hungry. Reproduction doesn't say, I need to reproduce now because there's an urge. No, it's a cell. It's taking in fuel and it's excreting waste products. It's sitting there metabolizing. Why did it reproduce? Why did it say, I have to make another model of myself because I know that I can't, I'm going to dissolve in the forces of the entropy
Mhm.
of nature. I'm going to dissolve. Why did that cell commit the ultimate purpose of reproduction? Reproduction is the ultimate purpose of all living organisms. All biologists will say that the only reason you exist is to have children and keep your genes in the pool. Why did that cell reproduce? It's not a lot. It's not. It doesn't feel anything. It can keep doing what it's doing. Why did it make a copy of itself? Because of telos, because of God, because of intention in the universe. There's no other explanation for it. It's as black and white as anything. I mean, why did you go to the gas station? Because you're almost out of gas. Oh, and the cell said, I'm going to reproduce myself. I'm going to. The other thing about
Yeah.
reproduction is it's the one thing, the only when you dissect an organism and you look at the kidneys and the heart and the claws and the ears, all of those things that the organism has are there for the survival of that creature, except one organ system that actually lowers your chance of survival. It's anti-Darwinian in the sense that it makes you vulnerable, it costs you energy, it puts you at risk, you might die, and that one organ system is the reproductive system. The reproductive system is the reason you exist, because everything you do is for the purpose of growing up and reproducing and then going through menopause and dying, because your purpose was to simply reproduce. Why did the first cell reproduce itself? Not for any biochemical reason, not for anything other than the fact that there must be a force that said, I want you to create life on Earth, go therefore and multiply. That's the ultimate. There's no refute to that answer.
That's good. That's good.